Is she engaging with diversifying her world and her life? Or is the only diversity in her life contained within her bookshelf? I want to have this video challenge the ways that we think about reading, especially when we often frame it as a way to increase empathy or to be more socially conscious, and what exactly that means and what the implications of that would be for both readers who are consuming this type of art and the writers themselves who are expected to make that kind of art. So I'm going to be talking about how books almost seem like they're being a productive chore, the ways that we kind of treat representation like a checklist. I'm going to reference to how readers have reacted to the Black Lives Matter movement and various tragic events that would compel them to start reading from marginalized groups, and in general how artists who happen to be people of color are often seen as educators instead of artists in their own right, and how we tend to value art more when we consider it to be useful, and if it's not useful then it's seen as more trivial. And this is only going to be part one because I have a lot more in-depth thoughts on the industry side of things that I'm going to say for part two. But what had compelled me to make this video and put my thoughts together is from reading two books and a couple of articles. I'll link them in my description. One of them is Dangerous Fictions and the other is How to Read Now. And I'll share some of the quotes that I highlighted that I found to be relevant to this discussion as well. So basically, we're going to be talking a lot about books and reading and what it means to read, which is why it's only fitting that today's sponsor is Book of the Month. Their mission is to bring the best new fiction forward. Every month, they go through hundreds of book titles and curate 5 to 8 books for you to choose from, and it's a really great way for you to discover new emerging authors. Each book is covered by a reader's guarantee, so if you end up not liking the book for whatever reason, they will replace it for free in their next box. Your reading is rewarded through the loyalty program too, so your savings start after the first 3 boxes. So let me tell you about the books that I picked for this month. I got Silver Elite, which is a very beautiful sprayed edge book. It's a new dystopian trilogy, which I would have never known about if I hadn't discovered it through Book of the Month. Same thing for the Amalfi Curse, which is a historical fantasy. So I really like that I can discover basically whatever kind of genre that I'm into, whether it's romance or thrillers, or in this case, fantasies and dystopians. For a limited time, you can join and get your first box for $5 using the code BOUQUET, and the box will even come with a free hat for new members. And now let's talk even more about books. The topic of this video was something that I started thinking more about when I had a conversation with a friend who was taking issue with how people only read books to turn your brain off, because in his POV, when he reads books, he likes to read them to expand his mind and learn something or take something away from it. And I disagreed with the way that he was setting those expectations on other people. And that's coming from me who reads for a similar purpose. Like I read both for escapism to turn my brain off, but then I also like to read other nonfiction or even fictional books to challenge myself in some kind of way, or read different perspectives. So it's both entertainment and education for me, but I don't think that it's fair to project those standards onto other people. I don't think books need to be an extension of your intellect or empathy or knowledge. So in our conversation, he brought up this example of readers who only read white, straight romances and never reading something different, therefore never challenging themselves. And I was like, yeah, those types of readers are probably people who are likely very closed off in their bubble. Their politics are probably surface level. Their friend groups and community groups are probably very monolithic. But to me, if some white suburban mom decided to pick up a more diverse book, whether that was due to social pressure of not looking racist, or because she actually wants to learn a little bit more about marginalized groups that she's not a part of, I would say that doing so still doesn't necessarily guarantee that she would be a better person or even like a more informed reader. Is Becky actually doing anything in her real life, in her community, in her friend groups? Or is she just tweeting about reading The Hate U Give and posting a nice little picture on her Instagram? Is she engaging with diversifying her world and her life? Or is the only diversity in her life contained within her bookshelf? I don't think that always translates one to one. And I also think that the idea of reading reading to improve yourself intellectually or socially is a flawed solution. Not just because I don't see it automatically translating to real world impact, but because it also puts this arbitrary standard on books and fiction and writers, especially a specific type of writer. So when I read this book, Dangerous Fictions, there were so many parts that I felt like summarized a lot of what I was thinking. And one of those is a quote that says, advocating for great fiction as just another wellness diet doesn't indicate any sort of respect for it, but rather instrumentalizes it into something positive and improving. That is something that can be justified as worthy of our time. And when so much of modern life has already been boxed up and packaged into something that's good for us, that makes us better citizens and better workers, it's no wonder that so many people turn to what they themselves call trash TV instead. The quickest way to kill many grown-ups' interest in a work of art is to label it as healthy and useful, to turn it into another productive chore. And the quickest way to kill fiction more generally is to declare that it exists to make you a better person, to train you into shape. If reading novels or watching films increases empathy, then the publishing industry in Hollywood ought to be full of the kindest, most empathetic people alive, instead of being legendary hotbeds of personal cruelty, misogyny, racism, and low wages for writers. And if enjoying fiction does somehow increase empathy, but the work of making fiction is a nightmare of backstabbing and inequality, it's worth asking why the difference between consumption and creation is so stark. If art produces empathy, it clearly hasn't been enough to overcome capitalism on its own. At best, it's just a feeling, a nice vibe, one which has not resulted in much needed change. It's interesting how the text describes how some people view reading as a productive chore, and it's supposed to be an activity that trains you to being a better person. There's this metaphor of comparing reading for empathy to exercising or having a healthy diet. So you should read more nonfiction books or books by diverse writers in order to be a better person, similar to how you should eat your fruits and vegetables. If you read too many trashy dark romance books by white people, that's like eating junk food. I'm sure that reading specific types of books can make you more socially conscious to a certain extent, but what I've seen online is people believing it can go way past beyond that extent, to the point where the type of art that you consume becomes a representation of your morality and your purity, instead of something that you're consuming as an expression of ideas and emotions. Now, a story can't be fantastical for escapism. It has to be for education. A story can't explore things that are flawed or messy without telling the audience the difference between right or wrong. Characters must exist for positive representation so that you can empathize for whatever group that they represent. But ironically, by having those characters be instruments or tools for good politics and having them only exist for good politics, that also makes them not represented in their humanity. Elaine, who wrote How to Read Now, points out the fallacy within believing this kind of thing. They say that the problem is, if we need fiction to teach us empathy, we don't really have empathy, because empathy is not a one-stop destination. It's a practice, ongoing, which requires work from us in our daily lives, for our daily lives, not just when we're confronted with a visibly and legibly other, not just when a particularly gifted author has managed to make a community story come alive for the reader who's come for a quick zoo visit, always remaining on her side of the cage. I feel like sometimes we oversimplify reading to be an act of resistance in the same way that people treat self-care as a brave political act without actually doing political acts in the real world within their communities. And that's how we make a performance out of it to be consumed by people on social media. I remember a couple years ago, I came home late around midnight and I was checking my phone after I was busy all day. I checked my YouTube comments and I saw that there had been a comment left for me a couple hours ago earlier in the day where this person was criticizing me for not speaking up about Palestine on my BookTube channel. And it was very ironic for me to receive this comment, because the reason why I was busy all day and was coming home late and had only checked my socials later on that evening was because I was coming home for a protest for Palestine that was in a different city. But because I didn't make a performance for that on my BookTube channel, and because I didn't post reading lists for Palestine for people who can only perceive me on social media, and I was doing work in the real world, that didn't really count, because if it's not on social media, then it's not really real, right? A couple years ago, I got locked out of my old Twitter account, readwithcindy. Since then, I've had to move over to _with_Cindy. So because I wasn't active on my old Twitter account where most of my followers were, I saw some people on book Twitter tweeting about how I was a fake activist because I wasn't tweeting about Palestine actively, when in reality, I had been to several protests in Palestine since 2021, but they weren't following my personal non-bookish Instagram account where I was sharing those posts. They weren't watching my general book wrap-up videos where I had talked about Palestinian authors that I had been reading lately. And generally speaking, people who were making those kinds of criticisms were very limited in their knowledge or exposure of whatever type of social media account they happened to be following for me and how often they were keeping up with that. To a lot of people in the book community, their expectation for activism is limited to the books that you are reading. So if you are not posting nice little pictures of authors that are from different marginalized groups, then you're not being an activist. For me personally, I don't consider myself to be an activist. I just go to these protests because they do represent issues that I care about. I don't view my bookshelf as a representation of how good of an activist I am. When I do engage with activism, personally, I'm not really interested in retweeting a bunch of things. I prefer going to protests and having face-to-face interactions. I prefer to donate to mutual aids and giving money to people privately. I don't like to announce every single time I donate to someone in need. And so I think it's ironic how people view bookshelves and social media performance as the only way to validate that you care about things. Which leads me to want to talk about the idea of representation. There's a push for people to read from a certain group of authors or read about characters that are of specific identities, because the more that you read those identities, I guess the better person you are, or the less racist you appear to be. I do think representation is important, and I love seeing representation in media because it often makes the stories more interesting and fun. That's why I host Asian Readathon, or I'll read authors of different race groups than I am, not because I think that makes me like an activist or anything, but just because personally I find it really boring to read the same stuff every time. Like, it's not even just diversity in terms of like race, but even in genres. Like, if you watch any of my reading wrap-ups, I like to switch up the genres that I read. So that's always how I've approached it. And what I always found really strange is when art gets made to take off a checklist for representation. I feel like this ironically results in the art being flattened or limited because you're viewing it in such a weird scope of fulfilling some kind of quota. And I love this scathing paragraph here from when Dangerous Fiction says, when the act of consuming fiction becomes a kind of politics, when viewing or promoting something that the far right dislikes is reimagined as a political act in itself, then there's something very nasty at work, something that's bad for both art and politics. Just as the reduction of art to political propaganda leads to bad art, the aestheticization of politics leads to bad, irresponsible politics. It's easier for progressive viewers to convince themselves that they've done something meaningful about ICE when they only watch a story that mentioned ICE for a minute. It's easy for them to believe they're personally anti-racist because they publicly support the kind of art that racists hate, art that often seems lazily designed to encourage and satisfy that hate. And this is especially bad when the art is bad and the politics are trivialized, because then the entire exercise is flat and insincere, reducing both fiction and politics to you, the viewer consumer, posting about how brave and anti-establishment you are for watching TV on your couch. One of the biggest examples I can think of in recent history of the performative act of reading for empathy was back in 2020 when white America discovered racism. There were protests all over the US and even other countries for George Floyd, who was unfairly killed and brutalized by police. People started making lists of anti-racist movies and TV shows and books. And while I understand the intention behind it, it always gave me a weird lingering feeling because it felt like we were reducing these books and movies and shows as some kind of educational material for race. Obviously, a lot of these lists and posts that are dedicated to platforming Black authors were framed as celebrating Black art. But when you're only thinking about these stories and boosting these stories as a response to some tragic event that happens, then you're not really treating it as art. You're treating it as useful lessons for non-Black people. Now, Black art only becomes valuable for its political usage, and Black pain is conveyed in art for white consumption. The transactional manner of the ways that we consume those types of stories, I felt like was really well exemplified in this paragraph that compares it to AI. The author for Dangerous Fiction says, the reduction of art to its supposed political value alone, to the useful/useless/helpful/helpless framework shorn of any judgment of actual aesthetic qualities, is a strong argument in favor of AI authorship. If only entertainment can save us, if protest art is the only meaningful way to battle damaging Supreme Court decisions, and if art by marginalized people is only valuable in hopes that it will combat bigotry, then we just need lots and lots of fiction, tons of books and movies and TV churned out very fast, and maybe sensitivity sensitivity checks by real underpaid human beings before being marketed to the right people. Our politicians just need the right poems about racism and climate change, which they can presumably read aloud on the House floor to themselves. And AI could be trained on overtly political art, on long lists of anti-racist movies. It could even steal from the very best so that it might educate the very worst. Even the concept of putting together an anti-racist list of books or media to consume feels like a vanity project, because the goal isn't even to learn more about a race or see how power and capitalism interacts with these different intersectionalities. The goal is to just become this vague, enlightened idea of an anti-racist person. I remember a couple years ago when I was new to BookTube, and this was during a time where a lot of BookTube was mostly white. There weren't really many booktubers of color that had big platforms, and so I was very lucky to just blow up as a channel. And during that time, there was another booktuber who would write very shady tweets about me and talk shit about me to her other friends, and I always found her behavior kind of weird because I had never interacted with her, but she would often interpret me in the worst kind of possible way, and it just felt very weird that she was so chill with all these other booktubers but had a problem with me. In my mind, I was like, this feels kind of subconsciously a little bit racist or discriminatory that you only have a problem with me. And then in the year of 2020, when BookTube was all up in arms responding to the Black Lives Matter movement, that was when this booktuber decided to pick up The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas and rate it 5 stars on Goodreads. Up until that point, all of the books that she read were always white and straight. If there were queer romances, they would only be with men, and those gay romances were always written by women. And so it's just very ironic to me that her response to BLM was to read The Hate U Give. And I assume that was a way for her to try to learn more about police brutality and try to enlighten herself to be an anti-racist person. But it's very ironic that her real life actions weren't reflective of that. It makes me question, what is the purpose of reading these types of books that have this representation or educational learning to be anti-racist? What is it really for if not to feel good about ourselves? And who is it really for? Because it's definitely not going to be for people who already knew and experienced those acts of racism. It's going to be for people who are in the majority. But what I find interesting is how this affects art made by marginalized people. The implication of reading for empathy is that you're going to learn from an author from a marginalized group, usually people of color. And so as a result, the readers and the gatekeepers of the publishing industry see writers of color as people who are chronicling the Black experience, the Asian experience, the Latin experience. Their work is supposed to show their trauma, their genocides, their forgotten histories, their diaspora, their oppressions, their experiences with racism. There is no usefulness in having stories about joy or trivial, low stakes kind of stories, because they're not going to teach you something. And if a piece of art is platformed for the ways that it shows joy, that is in response to the trauma and oppression that the group has. Therefore, that joy is still an act of resistance. That is where everything needs to be framed under. So much of our reading culture makes you pat yourself on the back because you were able to create a story or consume a story that is considered to be important. But the ironic part about all of that is that this reduces people to their most traumatic moments. And this also creates a dynamic of how usually white American middle upper class readers are expecting books by authors of color to teach them lessons or help them gain empathy. And that kind of expectation is not placed upon white writers. So that means you're going to writers of color for a specific type of experience. Meanwhile, white writers are there to show the universal experience. When they write about joy, it can just exist as joy. When writers of color write about joy, it has to exist as an act of resistance. They see these authors and their work as educators of their culture for you to learn from, instead of just being an artist in your own right. A quote I highlighted from Elaine Castillo says, "The arguments about the comforts or disruptions of art cannot be held in good faith if we don't address the fact that a white supremacist reading culture means we are conditioned to accept that some of our work is in fact routinely expected to comfort, that the work of writers of color must often in some way console, educate, provide new definitions, great epiphanies, and most of all, that buzzword of both the commercial marketplace and political theater, be relevant. Whereas the work of white writers must be free to offend, transgress, be exempt, be beyond politics, beyond identity, to delight, in other words, in the myriad fruits of his political immunity. And their readers must, in turn, always extend empathy toward that lucrative and culturally rewarded immunity, which is, after all, great art. So this double standard that people have creates this dynamic for writers of color to operate not just as a professional writer, but as a professional person of color. They now have to be the resource that people turn to whenever people are putting together panels or anthologies or reading lists, and they need more people of color to balance it out. And that kind of divide shows how, at the end of the day, even if an author were to create a rich, diverse story, if it goes through traditional Western publishing, it has gone through the pipeline with the evaluation of what would appeal to a white audience. Some quotes that I have highlighted say, "Fiction is supposed to be useful for our moral development and the moral development of liberal white people specifically. Fiction is something we consume to make us better, wiser, stronger. White people are supposed to devour stories about people of color as a kind of ethical protein shake." Castillo points out how writers of color, celebrated by the larger publishing world and often by themselves for their empathy-generating qualities, can sometimes find themselves diminished in the process. They're expected to continually provide stories of trauma and violence the way their ancestors once provided spices, minerals, precious stones, and unprecious bodies. The empathy industrial complex can never stop on its own. It will always need more and more ethnic tragedy to feed into the careless maw of whiteness, the frustrations experienced by writers of color at the hands of well-meaning but condescending white readers, are good evidence that the empathy industrial complex is ineffective, or at least is effective at building something other than empathy. It certainly provides the semblance of having done some kind of interior political work without having to change external material conditions. This quote from Dangerous Fictions is actually why I picked up How to Read Now by Elaine Castillo, because the first book had referenced these essays so much. And Elaine shares her own perspective as an Asian author, where she says, "I have no desire to write yet another instruction manual for the socio-cultural betterment of white readers. I don't know any writer who, if asked what they wanted their work to do in the world, would reply, make better white people. Equally, I don't see a sustainable way to continue in my industry without reckoning with the rot at its core, which is that, by and large, the English language publishing industry centers the perspective and comfort of its overwhelmingly white employee base and audience, leaving writers of color to be positioned along that firmly established structure, as flavors of the month, as heroic saviors, as direly important educators, as necessary interventions, classic American story / genre / historical episode, but now populated with brown people, continues to be one of the most dominant and palatable gateways for white audiences to become accustomed to seeing black and brown bodies on their screens and in their pages, as vessels of sensational trauma, but rarely as artists due to the same depth and breadth of critical engagement as their white colleagues, rarely as artists whose works are approached not just as sources of history or educational potential, but specific and sublime sensual immersion, sites of wonder, laughter, opulence, precision, a place to sink into the particular weather of a particular town, a place to pang at the love of strangers, thwarted or salvaged. And so that kind of expectation, when you have an industry that is mostly filled with white people as the gatekeepers. And I'm not talking about authors, but when you look at the publishing industry behind the scenes in terms of agents, editors, people in leadership positions for the big five, they are predominantly white across the board. And so they're reading these stories under the lens of a white person and trying to market it to white people. Even a diverse story has to still be appealing to a liberal white person. And so that kind of lens and the expectation of education and empathy affects the type of stories that not only make it through the pipeline, but get edited in a certain way that has to be appealing to a mass audience. I came across this really interesting anecdote when I was reading this article about a publisher that had started this imprint to support stories by marginalized authors. And even the leader within this imprint said that she found it can be hard for authors to tell authentic stories because they're so used to trying to make their work palatable to white cisgendered editors. Tripathy recalls a story she received from a trans activist and her mother about a trans child coming out. In the original version of the story, the child is in a defensive mode, fighting to show the world she's worthy of acceptance. My suspicion is that the authors had shaped the submission into something she believed a publisher would be more likely to accept. This makes sense because they were unlikely to encounter a trans acquiring editor, so they were modulating their voices to be heard. This anecdote reminded me of another conversation I had with an author a couple weeks ago where they were working on a story. One of their characters had they them pronouns. pronouns. And some feedback that they got for the story was that in a scene where the character was being misgendered and the character kind of just brushed it off because that happens all the time, and for that particular character, they just didn't want to spend the energy and time correcting every person that misgenders them. The feedback for this scene was that this character should be arguing against being misgendered in order to teach the audience that this was not okay. Otherwise, it kind of almost seems like you're saying that it's okay to misgender the character. And I thought this story was really interesting, especially comparing to the anecdote about the transgender character being on defense mode, because now you're kind of taking this character and not really paying attention to their personality, their preferences, their close proximity to how much they want to be an activist, and still you're trying to force or exaggerate certain interactions in order to be palatable. And it's almost like because a character is marginalized, they have to act like an activist fighting for their existence. And I think we should interrogate why we consider palatable stories to be ones that are focused on oppression rather than this character automatically getting love and acceptance. If that is how we approach representation, is that not a narrow way of depicting people across the board? And what does that really say about our values and our genuine interest in the type of stories from marginalized groups? Before I conclude this video, I do want to point out that I don't want people to take this as a reason to discount art from being political or empathetic. We're not here to complain that the act of reading has been ruined by the woke left and that we should just read whatever we want without considering anything deeper. This is not an excuse for people to keep reading the same white authors forever until the end of time. So don't get it twisted. The argument of not seeing color when you pick up a book or not being conscious of politics when making or consuming art is just as self-serving as the opposite end of the spectrum, where people are performatively consuming art to become or appear more woke. The issue that I'm trying to point out in this video is that we are placing a disproportionate burden and double standard on art created by people of color. So if you use that as an excuse to why you only consume white art, then you gotta admit that you don't actually care about people of color either. If you don't give a shit, you gotta own up to it instead of making up some moral reason for that. Because if you make up a moral reason, you're just like the other side. And if you're performatively giving a shit, maybe interrogate the expectations that you're putting upon people that you're expecting to teach you how to be a better person. I can understand why people encourage reading for empathy and the benefits of that, because reading is political. I absolutely do agree that it is. If it weren't political, then we wouldn't have all of these book bans. That is literally a political move made by our governments to censor and silence more progressive thinking. I also absolutely think that representation is important, especially for marginalized groups and for young people to see that their voices matter and to change the conversations that are going on in society. Advocating for representation in mass media that you see is part of shaping culture, because media is a reflection of the culture that we're living in. I think the best way of having representation and good art is to just let artists cook and give them those opportunities to cook in the first place without setting those double standards or diluting their work into something that should serve or educate a white audience. There is merit to art that serves that purpose, but the problem is when we expect all art to do that, because that flattens everything and ironically makes less diverse art in terms of content, themes, ideas. The purpose of political activism isn't to suffer or consume stories of suffering. The reason why people push for political activism, well, if you weren't performing that, is because you want better conditions for everyone. And that includes indulging in pleasures and having joy and being really into dumb, trivial things that make you happy and just having fun with that shit. Even if it's not educational or useful and it's just fun, that is what we should be aiming for. We should have a spectrum of stories by people of color that sure can be educational and important and useful or whatever. Maybe they move the needle in making people realize racial issues or whatever, but then we also should have really shitty stories that are just dumb and fun. It's having that spectrum is that kind of accurate representation that would be needed. And so to conclude this video, especially because the sun is once again creeping into my couch and I'm sweating a little bit, I'm gonna leave you with this quote here. Writing doesn't fix us or save us or make us better people. It just makes us more of what we already are and what we want to become. The world might burn to the ground and people will still write. The nature of these stories will change change as they always do. There are going to be panics over these changes, as there have been for centuries, and as there will undoubtedly continue to be until we break out of this feedback loop of incorrect certainty about what human art and human life is supposed to be like and how we measure its value. But what's amazing about this is that we don't have to sit and wait for stories to take their lucky effect. We don't have to wait for other people to watch the right movie or read the right book and wise up around us. We are all other people, and we aren't prisoners of reality as constructed by fiction or anything else. We can get up anytime and go outside. And so with that in mind, and conveniently the sun is also hiding behind the clouds, I'm gonna take this time to go outside myself. But in part 2, I do want to talk more about the publishing industry and how it's structured in a way that really serves for a white audience. This includes even authors of color who have learned to center and cater to whiteness, and that is largely how they have moved forward in this industry. And I'll also share some thoughts about how class and critique of capitalism under capitalism plays into publishing as well. So fair warning, if you hate it when I talk shit about rich people, you probably won't like part 2. But for those of you who are into that, I will see you next time. Goodbye.